The Letters of St. John of Avila, Part 1. Preface. This little volume contains the translation from the Spanish of a few spiritual letters of Blessed John of Avila. The author is probably not much known to English readers. Certainly he is not well known as he deserves to be, both for his own merits as a writer and because in his own time, the 16th century, and even beyond the limits of his own country, Spain, he was a man of great renown. He was recognized everywhere as a special servant of God, and as a true director of all souls desiring to walk the higher paths of perfection, or of those who needed help and encouragement to serve God in the humbler walks of life. He was also a preacher of exceptional power. St. Francis de Sales, in his Practice on the Love of God, speaks of him as the learned and saintly preacher from Andalusia, St. Francis Borgia as the Great Master, and he was popularly known as the Apostle of Andalusia, from the wonderful change which his preaching wrought in that district of Spain. His discourses were likened to fishermen's nets gathering in fishes of all sorts. Whenever and wheresoever he cast them, so plentiful was the harvest of souls which followed his expositions of the Christian writing. Perhaps it may seem somewhat strange that one endowed by God with such personal holiness, and who had been called to guide the souls of St. John of God, St. Francis Borgia, St. Peter of Alcantara, and St. Teresa, should have had to wait so long a time before being raised to the ranks of the formerly beatified servants of God. It is unfortunately not in any way necessary for us to explain such apparent neglect, but it was only on the 12th of November 1893, some 3 centuries and a half after his death, that Pope Leo XIII, of happy memory, decreed his beatification, and the faithful were invited to invoke his protection and aid under the title Blessed John of Avila. The writings of the great servant of God have hitherto been little known, at least in England, and it was with confident expectation that those who will read the letters here printed will find in them spiritual comfort and solid Christian teaching, for they have been translated from the Spanish. For the sake of those into whose hand this little volume may fall, who are unacquainted with the life of Blessed John of Avila, it may be useful to give a brief outline of his career. Letters and other writings of anyone wholly unknown to us do not, as a rule, interest us as much as when we have at least a general knowledge of their author and of the circumstances under which they were written. From a contemporary historian we learn that our author was born on January 6th, 1500, at Almovedar del Campo, a city in the Diocese of Toledo and in the Kingdom of New Castile. Spain was then under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, and the Church was governed by Pope Alexander VI. The parents of Blessed John of Avila were people in good social position and able to give him an excellent education. But more important than this, they were both truly and solidly pious. In fact, their son was given to them in their old age, when they had ceased to hope for children, as the direct result of prayer during a pilgrimage made in honor of Saint Bridget. From his early boyhood, Blessed John of Avila manifested signs of extraordinary piety, and it required little discernment to see that God had destined him for some special service in the Church. At the age of 14, he had finished his literary studies, and, as in the opinion of his masters, he gave promises of a distinguished career. His father sent him to the University of Salamanca to study law. After a 12-month spent in legal schools, however, he manifested such a distaste for secular studies that his father allowed him to return home. The next 3 years were spent almost entirely in the seclusion he made for himself, with the consent of his parents, in his father's house, and in which he devoted himself to the practice of penance and to the study of the science of the saints, which our Lord and his Blessed Mother as his chief teachers. At the end of this period of retirement, by the advice of a friend, he determined to prepare for the priesthood. With this intention he went to Alcala to commence his philosophy and theology, which he was fortunate enough to be able to study under the celebrated Dominican professor de Soto, who formed the highest opinion both of his abilities and of his exemplary piety. Whilst here he formed a lasting friendship with Don Pedro Guerrero, who afterwards became Archbishop of Granada, and whom several of his letters are addressed. Before he had finished his philosophical course, both his parents died. He remained on at the university until his studies were sufficiently advanced for him to receive the sacred order of priesthood. When he returned home to say his first Mass in the church wherein his 2 parents were buried. After this he disposed of his family property and gave the proceeds to the poor. The desire of his heart inclined him to the missions of Mexico, and, having no family ties, and having dispossessed himself of all his belongings, he seemed to see in his circumstances an indication of the divine will in his regard. He consequently made all preliminary arrangements, and repaired in 1527 to Seville, to await an opportunity of setting out for the scene of his mission. Meantime, his days and nights were spent in prayer and penance, and in filling his mind with that heavenly learning which only constant communing with God himself can impart. The design formed by Blessed John of Avila of leaving Spain to work in the Mexican missions was not, however, destined to be carried out. At the beginning of 1528, he was induced by ecclesiastical authority to renounce the idea in order to insist in the evangelizing the province of Andalusia. His first sermon was preached on July 22nd, 1529. He had looked forward with dread to the ordeal of facing an audience and speaking to them of the high mysteries of God and of their duties as Christians. On mounting the pulpit, his nervousness for a few moments deprived him of the power of speech, until he remembered that it was God's work, undertaken only for his sake, and raising his mind and soul to heaven, he said, "My God, if it be thy will that I should preach, remove from me this great confusion I am feeling. Do this, I beg thee, by the memory of thy bitter passion, for thou knowest whether I seek aught else but thy glory and the salvation of souls." At once his nervous distress passed away, and he became one of the most eloquent and successful preachers that Spain has ever seen. Whenever it was known that he was to preach, The church was thronged by crowds anxious to hear him, and great harvests of souls were gathered wheresoever he sowed the seed of the Word of God. Father Louis of Granada, who wrote his life, likened him to an arabesque loaded to the very muzzle, and which made great havoc at every discharge. Many instances are given of his life of the effect of Blessed John of Avila's sermons. The two most celebrated examples were undoubtedly the conversions of St. John of God and of St. Francis Borgia, which were wrought by the power of his teaching. The former, a Portuguese traveling merchant, came by accident in 1537 to a place where the holy servant of God was preaching, and by the effect of his burning words was changed from a worldling into with no higher thoughts than those of his business into a man given to heroic and lifelong penance. The change wrought in St. Francis Borgia was equally astonishing. In 1539, Queen Isabella died at Toledo after a few days' illness. Francis Borgia, Marquis of Lambay, who had been a member of the royal household, was chosen to escort the body to Granada for burial. On the arrival of the body, the coffin had to be opened in the presence of Borgia for the formalities of identification. When the terrible change that had been wrought by the hand of death in the features of the once beautiful queen was seen by Borgia and made a great impression upon him, Blessed John of Avila was appointed to preach the funeral oration, and, as if inspired to enforce the lesson already taught the courtier by the sight of the corrupted body of his former mistress, he spoke in forcible terms of the transitory character of the worldly honor and position, of the corruption that overtook all mankind alike, and from which neither king nor prince could escape. His words wrought the instant conversion of St. Francis Borgia, and by Blessed John of Avila's advice, he joined the Society of Jesus as one of the first disciples of St. Ignatius. For this great saint, and for his new society, which was founded at this time, our venerable servant of God always entertained the warmest affection and admiration. He sent many of his disciples to the Jesuits, and encouraged them in many difficulties and troubles experienced by them in their first beginnings in Spain. One of the letters printed in this little volume is addressed to Dr. Loarty, and another on their becoming Jesuits. Another is a letter of consolation to a dying son of St. Ignatius, and a third to friends undergoing persecution, is also perhaps sent to encourage some members of the society in their troubles. In the then need for Christian education and religious instruction in Spain, Blessed John of Avila regarded the foundation of the Society of Jesus as a marked instance of God's providence in providing for the wants of the Church. His opinion was communicated to St. Ignatius, and was a source of great satisfaction and consolation to him. Moreover, Blessed John of Avila gave so many practical proofs of his desire to assist the society in its early days, that he was accounted its best friend in Spain, and for all the foundations made by the Institute in Andalusia, it was directly indebted to his influence. For some years before his death, Blessed John of Avila suffered from constant sickness, which, however, he did not allow to interfere with his working for souls. He bore his maladies in the spirit of gratitude to God who allowed him to suffer something for his love, the spirit which he so earnestly exhorted others to cultivate, and as in the two excellent letters addressed to people ill, which are printed in this volume. After 16 years of suffering, Blessed John of Avila died on May 10th, 1569. Some of the works of this venerable servant of God have never been published, such as his treatise on clerical life and his remarks upon the Council of Trent. Of his published writings, his spiritual letters and his tract Audi Filia are best known. Both were translated into English in the 17th century. The Audi Filia in 1620 by L.T. and the Letters in 1631, but these editions, especially the English translations of the letters, have long been very scarce books. Even had they been easily obtainable, their antiquated diction and the involved nature of the translation would make them antiquarian curiosities rather than books practically useful for spiritual help at the present time. The letters with which we are more immediately concerned are very numerous. In French translation of Robert Arnaud d'Andalusia, they are divided into 4 sections or books. The first contains letters 22 in number addressed to prelates and other religious superiors. The second, those written to nuns and superiors of convents, in number 31. The third, letters to women of quality in the world, in number 63, and in the fourth, those to laymen of all kinds, 33 in number. The present selection of 25 letters has been made from the entire number, and affords examples taken from all 4 divisions. Though only a small number, they will be sufficient to give the reader some knowledge of the power and charm of Blessed John of Avila's epistolary style. Moreover, they set forth, better than any life can, the personality of this great servant of God. The letters of all great and good men are a precious inheritance to those who come after them, and they afford information about their inner souls, and an insight into the workings of their minds, which can be obtained in no other way. The Benedictine editor of the Letters of Augustine explains exactly wherein consists the special value of the documents he was gauged upon. As the eyes are to the other bodily senses, he writes, so are the letters of illustrious men in numberless ways more wonderful than all their other works. Just as no one can better show himself to the life than in his letters, so nowhere can he be better known than in them. Any careful reader may, in such letters, look into the soul of the writer, as if he were close at hand. Luis de Munoz, who is the author of one of the Spanish lives of the Blessed John of Avila, devotes a considerable space to the letters written by this servant of God, and to the spirit which dictated them. From early youth this servant of God, he says, set St. Paul before him as a model, and became the living image of the great doctor of the Gentiles, imitating him in his actions, preaching, and virtues, and indeed fulfilling the apostle's command Be ye imitators of me as I am of Christ. Munoz then goes on to point out how this imitation of St. Paul was manifested in the letters written by Blessed John of Avila. Just as the burning zeal of the apostle was not quenched with preaching to those who could hear his voice, but endeavored in his epistles to draw all the world to Christ, so Blessed John of Avila, his disciple and humble imitator, wrote an immense number of letters to all sorts and conditions of people. He had no idea of composing a volume of letters, nor could he have dreamed that what he penned would have been published, but providentially some of them, at least, were preserved, that after generations might enjoy his earnest exhortations, and profit by the spiritual food intended originally for the persons to whom the letters were actually addressed. It is impossible not to admire the style and vigor of the letters here printed. The doctrine taught them is solid and fruitful, and their persuasive quality speaks for itself. The words, says Munoz, have such power and force that they fire the most frozen and the hardest of hearts, and nobody can read them without wishing and resolving to change his life for the better. Many learned and pious theologians have looked upon the letters of St. John of Avila as amongst the most precious of the many writings of God's saints, and have declared that for them alone, in their opinion, he would deserve to be called a doctor of the Church. And, indeed, Blessed John of Avila's whole manner of writing is that some early father of the Church, whose aim was to secure not the good of his individual soul, but that of the whole body. His versatility is extraordinary, and he seems to enter fully into the difficulties that are proposed to him, though the subjects upon which he is asked to write are as numerous and as different as were the needs of the people who applied to him for advice. With what convincing and powerful reasons, writes Father Luis Munoz, does he not console the sad, encourage the weak, rouse the tepid, strengthen the timid, help the tempted, weep with the fallen, and humble the presumptuous. How admirable is his unmasking of the arts and trickery of the enemy! What wise counsels he gives for defending ourselves against him! What clear indications of the sign he set forth, by which a man may know whether he is advancing or falling back in his service of God! How he shows the weakness of the grace of nature and the power of grace! How clearly he exposes the vanity of the world, the malice of sin, and the ever-present dangers of his life! With what eloquence and insistence does he not exhort us to put all our trust in the fatherly care of God, and the merits of the precious blood of Christ! How efficaciously he urges upon us the virtue of patience in trials, cheers us in sorrow, and encourages us in afflictions and troubles! There is no state of life in the Church of which he does not make known the special duties and the means by which they may be fulfilled. He tells great lords how to govern their vassals and manage their estates, and he instructs priests how worthily to offer the holy sacrifice, and the preachers how to preach with fruit, and he shows virgins espoused to Christ how to guard zealously their purity.